I'd like to introduce Associate Professor Elana Taipapaki-Curtis. Elana, the doyen, if you like, of the Māori medical workforce development, an expert in health inequity in this country, the person who has been one of the, perhaps two, who's been responsible for bringing the number of medical students in this country, certainly in the northern end of this country, up to parity with us in the population. So people, can we please give a great hand to Alana.
Kia ora hui mara tātou, he mihi mahana tēnā kia koutou, ki te hau kāinga, tēnā rā koutou, kia koutou katoa hurinui te wharenei, tēnā koutou. Thank you, David. That was very cool. What's not so cool is that all my fellow presenters have dumped me for various reasons, so I'm sorry, you only get me. It was supposed to be a workshop. This is not a plenary. I haven't just promoted myself to a keynote, even though it looks like that. I'm really pleased to be here. This is a contested space for us, particularly for our non-Indigenous colleagues, I think. So I really want to bring in some of the evidence base rather than this is just what Auntie Tai thinks about cultural safety. And David's really started us off essentially. So I won't go too much, but you know, we've got these inequities. Everybody wants to do something about health equity right now in Aotearoa. DHBs are scrambling. Nobody knows what to do, but they know they need to do something. And increasingly, everyone's looking to cultural competency as their answer. Oh, we'll just be culturally competent, and that'll fix everything. And I think the key point I'm going to be making is, yeah, you can say kia ora, but that isn't ordering my angioplasty that I need, okay? So we need to just get our heads around this. We have cultural competency as a term in our licensing and our accreditation standards and our legal sort of requirements. That's an issue because what does it mean? And it means different things across those varying different bodies. It's also often core to our own, sort of as Indigenous health education experts. We have it in our curriculum, we think we're doing it, but are we? And what is it that we're doing? And basically everyone's going wee wah wah, everyone's got different definitions of everything, and we really need to get much more evidence-based and much more structured around the definitions and start to talk a common language, or at least define what it is you're meaning by cultural competency and cultural safety. So yes, this is a result of being talked in to do some work for Te Ora, to undertake, to deliver on a contract that really was a joint partnership between Te Ora and the Medical Council of New Zealand. I tried to resign from that work within 2 hours of looking at the requirements of the contract. And David said, no, you can't. You just have to carry on, otherwise we'll look like dicks. So, because I'm completely committed to Te Ora, I carried on and realised pretty quickly that I will just go back to my public health roots and let's start looking at the evidence base and let's do a decent literature review and just review everything. So this is really what I'm presenting today for you. So we undertook an international literature review on cultural competency and safety. We had a number of search terms. This is just to show you that I am really a public health doctor. So we did a really cool lit review. We identified a total of 51 articles and we found another 8. So a total of 59 sort of sources really have been used to inform what I'm presenting. We actually have just had this article accepted into the International Journal for Equity and Health, so it'll be published pretty soon. And there's some good resources in there for you in terms of the actual articles we've used as well as summaries of terms, etc. So just in thinking about cultural competency, David's already sort of gone there with us a little bit. The early definitions in the literature are very broad. We're talking about often describing it as a set of congruent behaviours, attitudes and policies that come together in a system agency or among professionals and enable that system agency or those professionals to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. So very much about there's a white professional with a brown patient, we've got to work out how to transport ourselves across the two cultures, the divide. So I actually dance for my students, embarrassingly. So I teach them this, it's like cultural competency is about cross cross-cultural situations, and that was really the context that it was envisaged in the early days, and it's all there in the literature, particularly the work of Cross and those people that first described cross-cultural contexts. There's multiple terms, heaps, like cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, cultural humility, cultural security, cultural respect, cultural adaptation, transcultural competence, and transcultural effectiveness are just some of them. And this is where it gets messy because there's so many terms and everyone's using them all differently. I think the key thing when you look at the literature around cultural competency is it's very much about gazing, that's the other second half of my dance, gazing at the exotic other over there to try and find out about them and to look at them and understand them rather than looking at the evidence of inequities, what's really causing inequities and professional complicity in that. In other words, if I can learn about that exotic other over there, my practice will be safe, it'll be competent, inequities will dissolve away, and we'll be great health professionals, okay? There were variations in the uptake of cultural competency, even in its broad definition early terms across the sector, and really nobody knew what the hell to do about it once you decided it was about that. It wasn't necessarily that clear about what interventions were required. So moving on to cultural safety and looking back in the literature around where that term's come from and how it sort of came about, it is very, very important to me to Dr. Irihapati Ramsden, who is obviously a leader not just for this rohe, but for Aotearoa. And when I think about her work, and now having gone back and read her work, it's just sort of before her time, actually. It's sort of like, it was all there, it's all laid out there for us, but it's like we sort of moved away, and it's sort of been morphed into something different than it really was. Irihapati was really about power, and the power imbalance that occurs in the transcultural situation. And that power relationship needed to adjust, had to adjust if we were going to get it right for Māori, but for all peoples. So her work, I think, is fundamental and have to acknowledge the nursing and midwifery sort of sector for leading that. But I also want to challenge the nursing and midwifery sector because I don't know what you're doing now. I think you led this, I think there was resistance, and when you look at the literature, it's not necessarily reflecting really progressive, fully embodiment of this cultural safety content in the way in which Irihapati described it. So I think there's some challenge, not just for doctors in medicine, but actually we've got to go back and just check in with how we are aligning ourselves to even this definition that came from nursing and midwifery. Out of this context, really in that context, was a rejection of transcultural nursing. So actually Irihapati very much clearly rejected that. It's not about understanding the ethno-specific culture. It's not about understanding what it means to be Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander or Māori. It's actually about recognising the individual as having some difference, but the obligations on you as the health provider to provide care that's appropriate for whoever is in front of you, really. Key to her under definition 2 and the early sort of definitions of cultural safety, you must understand your own culture and your own identity as the health provider, which really means gazing over the exotic other. It's not really important in this definition of cultural safety. How do you examine your own culture and your own identity is part of our challenge that I think we still have to work out, but that's essentially what is cultural safety in the literature in terms of later definitions. Also in the literature, there's a notion, particularly the work of Cross, that this is my third part of my dance. You climb up a ladder in cultural competency, just make your way up the ladder, and eventually get to the top, and then you're cool, you're at the top. So you go from cultural awareness to cultural sensitivity, and you'll finally get culturally safe. You'll achieve somewhere at some point. Definitely the literature starts to talk about, no, actually this is a major paradigm shift. It's a major jump. It's completely different. It's not a nice gradual increase up. You actually have to have a real headspace shift and change what it is that you're doing, because it's not that sort of graduating, finally getting yourself there. So the literature is starting to talk less of a continuum and much more of a paradigm shift in terms of cultural safety. Really, the more enlightened literature, in terms of my interpretation of it, that's come through is work like Kumagai and Lipson, who now took critical consciousness. And when we're talking critical consciousness, we're talking about, and it's sort of similar to what Luke was going on this morning, is it's actually, look at yourself, please. Stop looking over there at me or trying to learn about me, because I'm not the issue, you are. So look at your own culture, look at your own biases, look at your own stereotypes, look at yourself, look at your own values and what that is doing on the clinical encounter or the way in which we fund services and the way we set ourselves up. We need to shift our gaze. We're not doing that anymore. We need to shift it back on ourselves. And that critical consciousness then becomes quite a different thing. I don't need to take you to the marae. I don't need to take you on country for you to look at yourself. You can do it in your own bedroom. You can do it in the mirror. Michael Jackson did it. Oh. I did that last time too, when I did this talk. Let's go, let's move on. Okay. We want to put forward that we think a narrow understanding of cultural competency is actually harmful. That's what's there in the literature, that's what the literature is telling us. It perpetuates othering. We become the other, the non-white, the non-mainstream, the non-typical, the non-ordinary. It also perpetuates cultural stereotyping. But all Māori love to have their whānau next to them. Yeah, maybe, sometimes not. It perpetuates this notion of, yes, all Māori can speak te reo Māori, all Māori can go back to their marae, all Māori collect seafood, all Māori are poor, and all Māori play the guitar. Oh, my worst one is all Māori can sing, because that ain't happening over here. So that stereotyping, unfortunately, when you take that sort of, I can understand that culture, I can understand the other, you end up doing that stereotyping, and that's not helpful to quality healthcare. It homogenises Indigenous peoples into a collective they, rather than understanding the really diverse realities that we should be able to engage with as health professionals who are competent and safe. It promotes that cultural essentialism about, well, that's not a real Māori, or that is a real Māori, or whether you're valid and legitimate as a Māori or an Indigenous person. And that's not helpful. Ignores the power differentials and actually situates the power with the health provider, who can then learn about everything about the Indigenous other. Often it also perpetuates deficit discourse and victim blaming. We might blame that Māori patient for not having enough culture. Not as much as I do now know as a white physician. I know more than that patient, for example, which can be dangerous. Often doesn't look at structural analyses around what's really going on and what's really causing our inequities in health, and it suggests that there's an end point. And there really isn't. It's just an ongoing, lifelong, reflective process. So working with Te Ora and the Te Ora Executive, as well as co-authors, we came up with the definition that we proposed to the Medical Council of New Zealand. And I'd like to share it with you because we think this could be more fit for purpose for all of our contexts. Firstly, that cultural safety requires health professionals and their organisations, so not just the individual healthcare provider, but their organisation, to examine themselves and the potential impact of their own culture on clinical interactions and healthcare service delivery. It requires individual health professionals and healthcare organisations to acknowledge and address their own biases. I'm just going to stop there, because when you work with clinicians, to acknowledge that they could be biased, that's a very hard thing, because everyone wants to go to work and be nice, essentially. And we've also been trained to believe we're good people, and we generally are. But again, as Luke was saying, you can be a nice dad and a loving father and still be, racist. That was a nice word that I chose in my little brain. Yes, so you should acknowledge and address your own biases, attitudes, assumptions, stereotypes and prejudices that may be contributing to a lower quality of care for some patients. In doing so, we're saying that cultural safety encompasses a critical consciousness where professionals and organisations have to engage in ongoing self-reflection, self-awareness and hold themselves accountable for providing culturally safe care that is defined culturally safe by the patient and their community. So the power shift that Ihapati really highlighted must be there. And it requires health professionals and their organisations to influence healthcare to reduce bias and improve equity within the workforce and working environment. So that's part of being culturally safe, is to have a workforce that represents us as Indigenous peoples. That may mean getting out of the way if you're non-Indigenous, to allow your Indigenous healthcare workers that are beside you or actually underneath you to come forward as leaders. So overall, in terms of culture safety and where the literature has taken us, this is about explicitly acknowledging and realigning power, acknowledging own biases, encompassing critical consciousness rather than cultural knowledge acquisition, requiring a high level of self-reflective practice. It's less about the patient's culture and more about the culture of the provider. I want you to all to stop right now and think about whether your curriculum and your teaching reflects this. And if it does, that's good. But what else is it doing? And how are you marrying up the two? Because I think that we might get this, but I think we're all really busy doing our marae trips and doing a bit of te reo Māori lessons and stuff like that as well. But I want to talk a bit more about that. We want to remind ourselves, as Chelsea does, that the solution to racism is not cultural awareness. The solution is critical race consciousness, which has nothing to do with my culture. Thank you. I just put... Because whenever you talk Chelsea, it's love her. So yeah, our culture's not the problem. You've got to look at your own culture, your own white fragility, and deal with it. So, to sum up, we've got heaps of time for questions that David can take. Some recommendations. Well, I want you to focus on achieving health equity with measurable progress toward that endpoint. Okay, we're saying we've got to do equity, we get to do health equity. Well, how do you know when you're getting health equity? What are you measuring? How are you monitoring? We need to do that. We need to be aiming to eliminate, not reduce. Be centred on cultural safety and critical consciousness rather than those narrow-based notions of cultural competency. That's quite hard to do, and how are we going to do it? Apply cultural safety within a healthcare systems organisational level rather than an individual health provider-patient interface only. So right now DHBs are around New Zealand. Our district health boards are scrambling to try and work out what to do. And some of the key things they're doing are some implicit bias workshops for their staff, some institutionalised racism workshops. But actually, let's deal with some explicit bias, not just implicit. But more importantly, how is the system set up? What's the structure there? Is the senior management team prepared as they go on this journey rather than quickly jumping in and running a few workshops? Focus on cultural safety, which is not about understanding the exotic other. Address bias and stereotypes. That means we need tools to do that, and I think we're still in a challenge about how to do that really well. Focus on power, and include this in formal training across all the environment, systems, structures and policies. So that's quite big to do. What can we do, sort of us here, just trying to think about this, is if you're involved in accreditation or a college, you should mandate evidence of engagement, not just engagement actually with cultural safety, but that you are going to something and then you are being transformed in how you are working. So we don't just want you to get attendance, get your tick, I'm now culturally competent. You need to show evidence of your transformation and that of your cultural safe practice. So the evidence is very, very important. We're not very good at doing that yet. Ensure that we monitor as well. And that just happens as it happens. Require cultural safety training, performance monitoring for all staff, supervisors and assessors and ourselves and our fellow colleagues around us, because we do a lot of teaching and then there's a lot of unteaching that happens. So we need to manage that somehow. And acknowledge, and I think this is important, cultural safety is actually independent of anything Indigenous, because really the issue is not Indigenous focused, it's really non-Indigenous issues. That it's independent of anything about Māori health or Indigenous health or Aboriginal, Torres, Strait Islander health or Canadian health, Indigenous health, Métis health. Actually, it's quite standalone, but when we try and mix it with Indigenous health, we watered down the focus on bias, stereotype, prejudice, and essentially what's driving our inequities. And we do the nice to do easy stuff, learn how to sing a song, learn how to say kia ora, learn how to talk an Indigenous language, beyond country, hang with the locals. Well, why do they have to do that work? So I think we need to understand that that piece of work around being culturally appropriate, and you might want to know who the local iwi group is in your area, you might want to understand how to do a pōwhiri. Of course you should. That's just part of being a good citizen and a good New Zealander. That is very different than understanding cultural safety. And yes, our education system's failing us in terms of they're not coming to us with that knowledge. Of course they should, but don't try and pretend that that's what we're doing here around cultural safety, because it's not. Because you can create a competent, culturally aware staff member that understands how to do the pōwhiri and can do all that, but still has a level of bias associated with management of Indigenous patients. And that is what's killing us, I believe, and so does he. So, that's me. Sona nglajuang. Kia ora tātou.
Don't run away. Well, was that fabulous or was that fabulous? So, in the 80s, I taught first, third and fifth year medical students cultural sensitivity with her dad.
Oh gosh.
And people, this is a big challenge. This is a big, Elana has just produced a huge challenge for those of us who are used to working in that way. And the movement across this cultural safety is just huge. Iri Hapeti Ramsden was shared a thought after years and years of being harassed by health authorities, particularly medical ones, and she said, why on earth didn't I just call it safety? It was the word cultural that made it so hot. So, the floor is open. I am amazed by how you were a student of mine once upon a time, and don't they grow?
A very good student.
And don't some of us grow old?
Oh.
The floor is open, people. How are we doing this? Do we have a roving? There it is. Over here.
Yeah, chuck it.
Oh, really? Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Oh, you stay up, so you might want to both talk.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for your talk. I find it very relevant to the work I do. I do teaching in both undergrad and postgrad. When you talked about, I feel like I'm really loud. When you talked about having evidence about it, how do you foresee that looking?
Yeah, I think that when I'm telling you what to do, I don't have all the answers, first of all. I think that's our challenge, is to try and work this out around how would we know? I mean, some evidence would be if at least to acknowledge where your inequities are in your healthcare service delivery, and to at least measure that, and then to find ways, put interventions in place, and then to have evidence that those inequities are actually reducing, rather than evidence of attendance at some, our staff have all attended a cultural safety workshop day. The evidence should be more focused on seeing the inequity reduced and be eliminated.
Thank you. Who do I throw this to next?
Some more hands going up. Oh. Yell out. Yes.
Just 1 minute, sorry.
I think it's quite good to use the microphone so everyone can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me there? Okay. We've often talked about this. We teach this in, sorry, it's a bit of feedback there. Is that better? Teach this at uni across the 4 years. It's a postgraduate medical degree. However, what we really want to see is how's it working actually out there afterwards. And not wanting to sort of put a black mark on a door like the bubonic plague back in the past, but actually considering around recognising, particularly in the GP setting, the GPs that are working well and doing well. And I've often talked to Auntie Nita about that, to sort of say, well, we actually know from the community members who actually they want to go and see because they feel really safe going into that setting. And thinking about maybe, and we've discussed this quite frequently, as a community group getting together to say, actually we would really like to acknowledge those GPs in the GP setting, to say, whether it's a plaque or something, to put there to say, not only do we acknowledge that you're providing a safe environment for our community members to go there, but it's also to note out there. And what do you think of that idea? Because in one way it's that continuing that discussion when students become doctors and they're actually out there in the community as well. And hopefully that actually embeds a safe environment so when those doctors move on or retire, that the fact that they've been recognised by the community, that actually keeps it embedded within each of those organisations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. Okay.
Oh, sorry, Notre Dame, Fremantle, so thank you very much, yes.
Wherever you fellas are. I think what you're sort of describing there is a little bit, it is around sort of maintaining some power in the community, which I think is important. How you experience the clinical interaction is important, but actually that's not necessarily fully capturing cultural safety as we were describing it. Sometimes our communities may or may not know what care they need to get. And this is a real challenge right now where the tribunal report, for example, in New Zealand is telling DHBs to co-design with Māori mana whenua, who may or may not have the expertise right now to understand what all the health needs are at a structural organisational level and a regional level, and how is it really going to work. So there's some aspects in there. The experience of someone going through service that is good is obviously something we should always aim for, but it's not necessarily ensuring that that's culturally safe practice. A plaque on the wall, I don't really care about the doctor having a plaque on the wall. It also is aligning to those early definitions of cultural competency. Oh, look, you made it. It's because that's the whole, again, moving away. So, yeah, there's some, it's like a, yeah, do you want to?
If there were a bigger picture example of the difference between competence and safety, perhaps 3 days ago I spoke at a transplant hui, and the bones of the situation is that 66% of our renal failure in this country is in Māori and Pacific people, and 10% of renal transplant as first treatment is in Māori and Pacific people. So if you have a renal doctor who speaks Māori and who does all the right things and who can go to the pōheri and who's been to all the sessions, but is excluding Indigenous patients because of the criteria that the racist system sets up, in other words, a BMI of 35, if you don't have a BMI below 35, you're out the door. So they are systems that we need to look at, and those people need to look at those things hard. How are their biases? In this case on BMI.
I don't know which one. Right there. Oh. Thank you very much. I'm wondering, the critical consciousness lens, have you applied it to a particular site yet? Say a medical school or an organization, to see if they've done that work? And if so, is it published anywhere?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. What was that?
Oh, okay.
I think it's just not coming through. Just speak up. Yeah.
Okay. So your theory, the critical consciousness, have you applied it to a particular site, a med school or an organization? Have they done that work, or have you done that work to see what that looks like? And if so, is it published?
Well, we use the term critical consciousness in our teaching. So we actually focus our teaching a lot on racism, privilege, understanding the definitions for our students, and also then looking at ways in which you can intervene. There's things like racist cleanses and stuff that you can do. I don't know how effective they are. But the IAT, the Implicit Association Test, taking students through that so that they can start to acknowledge they have biases. And then there's notions in the literature around the more you acquaint yourself with people that you may have a bias against or expose yourself, that can have an influence. And yeah, it's all framed around them getting a critical consciousness about themselves.
Right.
So I think that's what you're asking.
Yeah, and just interesting at the higher levels. So it's like you're working at one level for the training to start thinking in this way, but within the existing systems with the deans and the people that control, have they done this work of self-reflection?
What do you think?
Fair enough.
You can answer that yourself, surely. No, I'm joking. I think that that's definitely a challenge. And that's the first place it should start, is the head, the deans and the senior management teams, etc., or funders and planners, etc. And so, but because they can control things, they have to be open for that. And I think this is a big challenge for all of us from here on in, is we're just getting our definitions right now. And that's really what I was sharing today. And I think our big work we've got to do now is understanding how best to do it, being able to show that when we do it, it actually has an impact and you can actually reduce inequities. And I think there's some evidence base out there, but there's less evidence base around showing when you put in place an intervention for critical consciousness that it actually is related to a demonstrable reduction in health inequities. We hypothesise it is important, but we still need more evidence base around that.
One of the markers of exactly how difficult this is that it is the converted audience of those who Elana's been working with to produce these recommendations, to send them back to a converted audience at the council, the medical council, and we have twice she has basically sent us back to the drawing board twice because we kept getting it mixed up and we're the converted audience.
Yeah, and you still haven't got it right.
There you go.
If you want to have a look at the Medical Council revised statement on cultural competency towards achieving cultural safety for health equity, something like that, you'll still see there's a mixture of Māori health, attitudes, knowledge-based things to do in there. My advice to the council was to not mix that up and to be very clear, let's just have a statement on cultural safety which has nothing to do with Indigenous health per se, and you've got to do that other work differently. And when you keep mixing it up, you confuse everyone. So even with this literature base, all we could do was take them, we could only advise them. But yeah, still a struggle for a very willing and wanting to do better council, still struggled to get through and respond to the advice that they were provided with.
You'll be very pleased, my student of 30 years ago, that we think we've got it right and we're sending it back to you next week.
Yeah, I'll be sending you my invoice too.
Hello.
And the closing remark is really that we have been doing cultural competence in this country for 30 years and it has not made a single bit of difference. Cultural safety forever, and Elana Taipapaki Curtis, kia ora tātou.
Oh, yes, it has. Oh, yes, it has. This is for us here. I have worked in the university for 20 odd years. I don't have a university degree or anything like that. And much of what you lot say, I don't understand. But I'm telling you now, it's happening. I don't remember when you graduated, Elana.
We're not going to either.
Hi. Excuse me, just
But
a
I
moment.
do
Please
remember
hold the
very
box
clearly.
closer. Just lift the
Sorry?
box closer up to you. Thank you.
I do remember very clearly being in an office of the Department of Māori Health at the University of Auckland's faculty on the day that Elana graduated, or soon after that. And the one word she said, the few words she said when she walked into that office of the Department of Māori Health was she's going to change the way we are admitted to med school. Because in those days, to be admitted to the med school at Auckland University, you had to prove that you were Māori. And look at her now. That's been changed. That's all been changed, and what they're saying now, that's going to happen too. Nō reira, ngā mihi nui atu kia koutou. Tēnā koutou.
Kia ora whai, Julie. Do you want us to keep going? Or? Oh, yeah.
Sorry, this one.
So, ladies and gentlemen, just a wee note when using the catch box, which is an awesome toy you can throw around, just hold it nice and close up to your lips and we won't get any big squeaky noises. Thank you.
Hello. Anita, I'm looking forward to reading the article, and linking your presentation with Luke's presentation this morning, if this is so important, in what ways, and I know your work was with the Medical Council of New Zealand, but what ways do you think we might be thinking about these attributes in terms of admitting people to medical school as part of admissions requirements?
Well, I think we have to, one of the key questions whenever we think about this is, are we selecting students, that I guess are going to be open to this to learn, and hopefully by the end of being with us for 6 years or so, we can teach them to be culturally safe? Or are we expecting them to come in and be completely culturally safe at the beginning, which would sort of mean you don't need a medical school? So I don't know exactly, we obviously don't want people with overt biases and prejudices to come in, but I don't know whether any of our selection tools really pick that up, to be really honest. And then we would have to ensure that whatever we do, we could take someone with overt bias and prejudice, or even not overt, and make sure that they come out transformed. Otherwise, we're not going to help create a culturally safe health workforce. But there needs to be much more done in our curriculums to do that. And will we get time? We do have to teach about our culture and our health, about our health situation and our culture somewhere, but it's just different than the act of doing cultural safety, and you need to do both, I think, is what's needed. I don't know if I'm answering your question very well.
Hello. Hi, my name is Terry, and it's more of a comment related to a couple comments ago or a couple questions ago around like critical self-reflection or self-reflective practice and narrative medicine. So I did my resident research project as an autoethnography, and there's actually evidence within the narrative medicine self-reflective practice world around the fact that self-reflective practice is the core skill in both physician well-being as well as in cultural safety training. And kind of the ways to do that, or some ways that I've seen to do that, is that there are certain electives or small groups that happen in art galleries where they're looking at how people see art, and they go around and you share and you kind of learn that different people see things differently, as well as through other means around like drawing or producing art themselves to kind of critically look at themselves and their practice, as well as using the more narrative lens or writing, which are all ways that aren't directly related to Indigenous health per se, but help to build that skill of critical self-reflection. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there.
Cool, thank you.
Yep.
Done. Thank you. I'm an All Black. I have always been thinking that from the point of Indigenous health and many aspects, starting younger is so important. Oftentimes, by the time someone gets to med school, they're a fully formed individual. And, clearly you've described to all of us here a paradigm shift, and we're all sitting here thinking we need to rewrite everything. This is going to take a long time. And I'm just wondering, is this being fed down to the teachers, colleges, into school environments so that we can really sow these seeds at a time when people are the most impressionable?
Yeah. Yeah, of course it needs to start earlier, but we need to control what we can control. thinking of Taika Waititi right now, with his New Zealand really racist as beep. I get regular emails in my inbox going, oh, kia ora, Elana. I hear that you're an expert in culture safety. Our college is very committed to Indigenous health and culture safety. Can you please look at our framework and get back to us in the next 2 weeks with your feedback? And I say, kia ora. What you're asking for requires a high level of expertise that would normally be expected to have a fee. If you'd like to talk about my fee, please come back to me. And then I get no other email. And so I think that colleges have to do much more than send an email off expecting me to give over my intellectual property and Indigenous knowledge for free over a frickin' email. And I know that I should be happy because they want to do the work and they're trying to do the right thing, but they're not doing it right. They're not really truly committed. They're not even respectful enough to engage in a proper conversation and understand that it might need to be paid just like everything else they pay for. So colleges that are here, welcome. You're awesome because you're here. But remember to bring your bank account details and stuff like that. Yeah, no, I just want more substance behind what if people are going to do this work, make sure they understand what it does entail. There aren't many people with the expertise, but don't expect it for free. Factor it into your organisational structure. This work is going to take money, it's going to take time, and it has to be done over a long period of time, and it's going to have to keep happening, and every time we don't get it right, we have to try and find another way to get it right. And that might include working with schools and school sectors around who we bring in. I mean, I do that work as well, but it's different sort of work. But yeah. We should wrap up soon, shouldn't we? Yeah.
Are there any last questions?
We've got one
here
and one there.
Well, there are people who really want to talk.
Oh, yeah.
You've got people going.
All right, then I'll keep going for 12 minutes.
Nunu te mihi ki a koutou, mō tō koutou mata ki te hōhonu. Kia ora, I'm Robbie. I've really enjoyed hearing about critical consciousness and moving an individual to move past their own bias. And you've established that learning the matauranga, the knowledge of another people actually isn't really helping in that situation. So in moving through our own bias, have you, the space that the thought coming forward for me is learning in your own identity. Have you created a space that through sharing of pūrākau, your own identity, that we, as the medical students working through bias, can grow in ourselves as well?
That was a hard question. What do you mean? Could you just elaborate a little bit more for me? Sorry.
I mean, the first one is non-Indigenous, growing in the identity of yourself past your stethoscope.
Okay. Well, I'm lost. So I don't know if it's because I can't quite hear. So about how to grow your own Indigenous identity?
Your own identity, whether Indigenous or not.
Oh, yeah.
Past your merit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a bit about understanding yourself and being able to be self-reflective about who you are, what you bring to the table, what it is that you've grown up under, what your values are, how you know what you know, how do you know what to be true, what is the truth to you, and being prepared to challenge all of that. You know, some of it's in the personal and professional domains of our medical curriculum. So it's important work, but it's not really given as much sort of kudos. Like, are we prepared to fail a medical student because they've failed the Indigenous health portion of the curriculum?
Yes.
Woo! Like to sit in that Board of Examiners meeting. Hey, Andy. You know, like, imagine that.
Yeah. Elaine, it's Miriam here. Yeah, I am. My question is, we talk about critical reflections and we talk about writing curriculum and all that. I mean, my understanding is everybody reads stuff, then they put it away and then throw it in their cupboards and never see it again. So why can't we, as visual people that are in this room, why can't we do more stimulation for CPD for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and Māori people and in our Canadian friends as well? So why can't we implement that into our medical curriculums as well? More visual, more simulations programs that need to be put in, do hands experience that way and assess them that way instead of just going tick a box, come, you've done cultural workshops. Why not do hands-on in front of you and you assess them?
Yeah, I think there's already sort of people working towards that, and we've got aspects of that with the WHO process down in Christchurch, and we use the WHO process as well, which is like a simulated patient scenario that students do. It can, though, still lead to a bit of stereotyping and cultural essentialism, so we do need to be quite careful with that. But imagine if you could put a virtual reality sort of mask on a student and you create these scenarios and then see what they do, and then you can point out their racism or something. You know?
I'm not just referring
you should have put the needle there, but you didn't.
Yeah, I'm not just referring to students, sorry, Elana, I'm not just referring to students. I'm talking about when they actually leave being a student to be doctors as well.
Yeah, all of it.
The whole lot, yeah.
Yeah. So yes, so those are the challenges for us. How can we do this better? What tools do we need? How can we get creative? Whilst making it fun and interactive in small groups.
Thank you.
Elana, can I ask a question? Can I ask a question?
I should have made my presentation longer.
You should have. The question, can the old dog ask the new dog a question? The question is there a place for what we're already doing? So, you know, we still need, and you referred to it as being good New Zealanders, we still need to be able to pronounce names correctly. We still need to be able to not bugger up the idea that there's 10 people around this bed. So we still need some competence-based stuff.
Yep.
Have we got a place where these two things are now walking hand in hand?
Well, I think that I teach Indigenous health. I do have a whole module, for example, on doing those things. Pronunciation, getting all students to present themselves using a pepeha and te reo Māori with, support for that. I think that's helpful. It has to happen because you can't really understand Indigenous health without understanding what it means to be Indigenous or to have some knowledge about Indigenous culture. But please don't confuse that as achieving cultural safe practitioners. And I think that's the key point that you should take away. We need both. There needs to be a place for this. Now, that's an Indigenous health curriculum. Cultural safety may or may not be associated with Indigenous health, actually. It could stand alone on its own, because remember, it's not about Indigenous culture. But we're often dumped with doing that. And of course, all clinicians teaching throughout the curriculum should be culturally safe, but they're not. So we've got a lot of unlearning happening. But I'm trying to, in my promoting the definition of cultural safety as critical consciousness, nothing to do with our culture, is a different argument than the need to actually have this baseline knowledge, understand the history of colonisation in our countries, understand how Māori, how Indigenous peoples operate. That's just, it's Paparangi's term actually about that's just being a good New Zealander. The Indigenous health team should not be having to teach the whole school how to be a good New Zealander.
People, we've probably come to an end, and can I ask us all to give a big hand to Elana?